The next article on the list is talking about Skydio. So some have dubbed the Skydio drone as a selfie drone because of its ability to autonomously track and film a subject. Now, they're saying that somewhat secretly or a little bit under the radar, they've been scoring millions of dollars worth of government contracts. They say Skydio has been pivoting to government work the last year. The DEA gave them $200,000 contract following a $16,000 order in August of last year. Scored a $3 million contract with a $3 million contract with the U.S. Army, $1.5 million deal with the Air Force, kind of as it ramps up its government work. Don, I think no brainer. Let's kick this over to you first. Air Force veteran. What are some of your thoughts on these government contracts and Skydio's work, with these government agencies?
Well, look, this is a lightning rod issue right now, right? So we're talking about cybersecurity essentially, and concerns that there's possible foreign intelligence collection with foreign drones. I mean, whether you agree with the information you're seeing in open source or not, there's a big debate right now, and both sides are firmly entrenched. But the bottom line here is the United States government is taking certain actions, right, wrong, or otherwise. That's the direction they're going, and the American Drone Security Act, it kind of flew through, the Congress to the extent that it could before everything pretty much shut down with COVID. But the key about that is that it was a bipartisan effort. Okay, so when you look around and you see how toxic, and let's be frank here, it's a toxic environment right now when you're talking from a political standpoint and even geopolitical standpoint. The lines have been firmly drawn in the sand. Everything has been politicized, and people are saying this issue with foreign drones is just a political issue. My counter to that would be, okay, this is the one thing that both sides of the aisle have actually locked arms on and are moving forward about. And so when you talk about Skydio and why Skydio and what they're doing, Skydio would be, at least under the draft ADSA, they would be one of the only American companies that's actually ADSA compliant. And I think what you're seeing is all of these government agencies are leaning forward, and that's why they're building this kind of portfolio. And then I think the related issue that you've raised is this idea of surveillance and what are the agencies doing with these drones, right? So, and what I'll say to that is, having worked in this area, at least for the DoD, intelligence oversight rules and laws apply to the domestic use of drones, and surveillance is a term of art. I mean, it is a very specific term, and so it starts with Executive Order 12333 that was written in the Reagan administration. And it governs the collection, retention, dissemination, and oversight of the information on federal drones. And during the Obama administration, there was he put out a presidential memorandum called Promoting Economic Competitiveness while Safeguarding Privacy, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties in Domestic Use of Unmanned Aircraft Systems. It still applies. It's still out there. It's dated February 15th, 2015. You guys can look it up yourself. I encourage you to read it. But what it tells all federal agencies to do is to put in place rules to protect privacy and civil liberties. And what's not clear to me, and frankly, I haven't had time to dig deep in, I'm fully tracking the DoD side just because I was involved in it. But from, the other federal agencies, whether it's the FBI, ICE, how have they implemented that executive order is unclear to me, but those requirements do apply. And the whole point is to protect the privacy and civil liberties of United States citizens. And that's a pretty high bar. I mean, that's a constitutional issue. So, I can certainly talk more, but I'm sure Miriam has some thoughts.
Well, I actually thought that whole article was fascinating from top to bottom. And one of the fascinating things about it was that Skydio responded to the article and requested Forbes to add a statement to the end of the article saying, specifically, we don't we're not secretly trying to produce this great spy drone, basically, that they really support civil liberties and so forth. And I mean, I'm not a neutral party. I am all about unmanned systems. I believe firmly in unmanned systems. And one of the things about an unmanned system in this particular context is it's unmanned. So whatever side of the argument you feel, I feel that it is less threatening to anybody on the streets to have a drone there rather than an armed presence, right? So if those are your two choices for security, I think that an unmanned presence, and I think too that people don't like the idea of a drone flying overhead and taking pictures. It's unfamiliar. But, I'm a Boston local. We had the Boston Marathon bombing. They caught those individuals so quickly and so effectively because there were cameras everywhere at the end of the Boston Marathon route. They were cameras posted outside of the stores everywhere along that route. So if you think that no one's ever capturing your image, you're just mistaken. Just because you happen to see a drone flying over your head does not necessarily increase the probability of this data. So I think Don's absolutely right. There are strict protocols in place. There are high bars of we do protect our citizens' rights. And quite honestly, I think, unmanned systems are such a valuable resource that we shouldn't limit our military's use of them because we have these weird fears about flying cameras. We had weird fears about cell phones. When we had smartphones, people were like, people are going to be taking pictures of me on the subway. There are weirdos taking pictures of people on the subway with their cameras, but now we want them anyway.
Yeah, I just want to jump on Miriam's comments with two quick points because I think there's been a lot of confusion. Look, we can't be tone deaf to what's happening in our country right now with the civil unrest and concerns about social injustice and Black Lives Matter. The concern the concern is overreach, right? It's, so what are you doing with that drone? What are you doing with the information? Why do you have the right to use it? And we're talking about the federal level, but what I also wanted to mention is at the state level. Between 2013 and 2016, there was an explosion of state laws across the country that specifically prohibited police departments from using drones to collect evidence or information without a warrant or without some other statutory exception, ones that frankly at the state level, they somewhat created as a hodgepodge because we had, Fourth Amendment jurisprudential, we had a bank of cases and jurisprudence on this topic. And what the states did, it was almost like a smorgasbord of, well, yeah, we'll take that one. We'll include consent as an exception, but some didn't. Mm-hmm. And so you had, what rules apply at the state, and it depends on who's flying the thing and, what the state law said. And, again, if it's federal, you're talking about the executive order and then those executive rules. The other thing I wanted to say about the military's use, domestically, I just want to be clear, absolutely clear about this. The military does not have a domestic mission to do law enforcement. Okay.
And that issue particularly came up this week.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you've seen a number of people come out again, I want to remain apolitical on this, but when it comes to the law, it's clear. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act, and it goes back to the 1700s, might have been the early 1800s, where it prohibits using law enforcement or using the armed forces to enforce the laws. And, there's historical reasons for that. Now, there's exceptions to that, but man, we have not triggered those very often. And so that's why you're hearing this crescendo of voices saying, our own citizens are not the enemy. Do not place us in a position, in a military standpoint, of us versus them. I mean, heck, you look at any statistic, less than 1% of our population volunteers, all volunteer force. Less than 1% of our citizens volunteer to go into the armed forces. So we're a minority. Like, so let's not create this other schism, within our society. And I just wanted to foot stomp how important it is to abide by the rule of law when we're talking about the use of drones, especially when we're talking about First Amendment and people's right to assembly and right to speech. That's the point of President Obama's executive order, all of these rules, and really at the bottom line, the point of our Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, even from a historical context, if you look at the first four amendments, they're drafted by people who were concerned about a standing army,
Right.
Specifically British soldiers at that time, and that's why those amendments actually separate those powers very clearly, and where the state is as far as your private papers, where, the Third Amendment got pulled up by Mayor Bowser for quartering soldiers. The amendment everybody forgets. But it's interesting to see this overlap, because I think what's triggering it is that because of that separation, we even separate our vendors mentally. We say, okay, DJI is a commercial vendor, a consumer vendor. You wouldn't expect them, even if they were an American-based company, to have your toy drone on the shelf end up as military gear. But the truth is that happens. Look at a company like GE, right? People don't realize that their consumer products from GE are really just kind of a marketing arm of a defense contractor or a government contractor. So I think it's kind of just the first time in the drone industry, or the small UAS industry, that we're seeing one of our players from the consumer space engage with the military, and maybe the public doesn't understand what that separation is. The use of drones, I think also the military funding thing kind of gets muddied, because they're saying, or just any military investment in the commercial sector kind of muddies the conversation a little bit. What people don't understand is that the military or the Air Force or whatever branch is actually just investing in the commercial infrastructure to make sure that we are protected for things like resources being in deficit. Perfect example is the PPE that we didn't have in this country when COVID hit, was the result of so much manufacturing being offloaded to China that we just didn't have the resources available initially until the supply chain was able to balance out its spreadsheet there. So the military's investment is coming from that angle, correct, Dawn?
Well, yeah.
That and security, but that's an important piece, right?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Mike. People don't appreciate I call it the symbiosis between military research and development, and operations, right? The need for equipment, and the commercial sector. It's a symbiotic team, because there's actually statutes. I just wrote an article again for Inside Unmanned Systems magazine that talks about technology transfer and transition, or this T3 concept. And there's a whole host of statutes that permit the military and federal laboratories to engage with industry, to collaboratively engage in research and development, to create products that then can be transitioned back to military use. And so that's exactly what we're talking about here. When you talk about drones, you talk about whether it's GPS, that frankly the military, R&D came out of military R&D, the internet. When you think of all the big inventions, a lot of them, started in the military, and working oftentimes with industry hand in hand. That, what the military can't do, obviously, or the feds, is manufacture them. And so that's the partnership. Okay, here we've created this wonderful invention. You go off, you manufacture it, and there's a bunch of different companies, which I mentioned in the article, like Miltech, and that whose job is to be partnership intermediaries, and that's a statutory agreement between the government and industry, where they go out, they find a partner, the partner produces it, and then sells it back to the military. So
that's how we got the moon lander.
Exactly. So Miriam has her hand up.
Well, I also think the other thing to bring up here is that there's a huge growing sector at state and local public safety agencies, right? And so the Skydio capability also could lend itself very well for fire use, right? So for the use of fire departments and police too, public safety. So I think that should also, because those capabilities of the selfie drone capability, but the autonomous nature really lends itself well also to this huge growing sector, which again I think people tend to react to the small use case of law enforcement and not think about it in the much more common use case of protection, search and rescue capabilities and protecting law enforcement officers and surrounding neighborhoods, when there's any kind of an incident, to monitoring egress in and out of a fire scene or things like that, to really what I would call the protective applications. I think that the actual enforcement applications that law enforcement or sort of more, I don't know how you say it, aggressive applications are really minute compared to the more common uses for this technology, which are protective and beneficial, for fire and for search and rescue and for public safety agencies. And so that's a huge growing sector in communities where communities are going to see this technology. So the U.S. military invests in this technology. It can benefit small communities everywhere, small, large, everywhere.
I feel like we could talk about this for the entire podcast.
Yeah, good. There's so much more to talk about.
It's a good one.
Right. There's a couple really interesting things going on, right? I mean, there's the impact that government, military investment has on the commercial side. And I remember, Mike, when we had Brian Garrett Glazier on, a couple of his articles were talking about just that, kind of how military investment and Air Force investment was speeding up innovation in the commercial sector.
Yeah, and I'm always cautious of them picking a winner. I think that they should feed the commercial market, but they shouldn't fall into kind of the state capitalist or socialist model of China, where they pick one and they just fund that only. The more diversity in the market, I think the better the products we will all get.
Right. Competition creates innovation, usually.